So we continue our discussion of Dryden's of dramatic poesy. We were looking at Critus' speech on the three unities of drama, and the last unity, that is the unity of action, the most important unity discussed by Aristotle. As for the third unity, which is that of action, the ancients meant no other by it than what the logicians do by their finish, the end or scope of any action. This I have already discussed. So finish means both end or finishing of the play, but also goal. The poet is to aim at one great and complete action. The action must be complete, to the carrying on of which all things in his play, even the obstacles, should be subservient. This paragraph I explained. For two actions equally laboured and driven on by the writer would destroy the unity of the poem. So the idea presented here is that there should be only a single important action or plot. If two actions are equally important, if there is a double plot, then the unity of the poem or the unity of the drama will be hampered. Now this is an issue on which there was a lot of difference among the practitioners of drama of that time. Most of the Elizabethan Jacobean, I mean not of Dryden's time, even in Elizabethan and Jacobean period, we see that there are many plays that have an alternative plot. We often call this a subplot. In Shakespeare's plays we find regularly subplots. Dryden calls them here underplot. The subplot kind of parallels the main plot and re-emphasizes the theme of the main plot. Even Ben Jonson, for example, sometimes has a double plot in Volpone, for example. So this was a convention, and Dryden does not altogether reject double plot because most English writers use it. But through Critus he raises the idea that normally there should be a single plot, otherwise the impact of the play or the unity of the play will be hampered. It would be no longer one play but two, not but that there may be many actions in a play, as Ben Jonson has observed in his Discoveries. Ben Jonson's critical work, Timber or Discoveries, there Ben Jonson observed that all the actions in a play should be subservient to the main plot, which our language happily expresses in the name of underplots. That is, in English they are called underplots. Such as Terence's Eunuch is the difference and reconcilement of Thais and Phaedria, which is not the chief business of the play, but promotes the marriage of Caria and Creamy's sister, principally intended by the poet. So Dryden says that example of such use of underplot or subplot can be found among the ancient writers also, and gives the example of Terence's Eunuchus, where the principal plot is that of marriage between Caria and Creamy's sister, but there is the underplot of the reconcilement of Thais and Phaedria. Dryden's principal source in these matters is, however, Corneille, the French theoretician and dramatist. There ought to be but one action, says Corneille, that is one complete action which leaves the mind of the audience in a full repose. But this cannot be brought to pass but by many other imperfect actions which conduce to it and hold the audience in a delightful suspense of what will be. So even Corneille says that there should be some small actions or imperfect actions, all of which will lead to the principal action. Because the most important goal of a play is to provide a complete action to have an impact on the mind of the audience. If by these rules, to omit many other drawn from the precepts and practice of the ancients, we should judge our modern plays, it is probable that few of them would endure the trial. So if we try to judge our plays now, we would see that many of them would fail to fulfill this criteria. That which should be the business of a day takes up in some of them an age. The action which should be covered in a day takes an age. Instead of one action, they are the epitomes of a man's life. A man's entire life is, kind of attempted to be represented. And for one spot of ground which the stage should represent, we are sometimes in more countries than the map can show us. So the dramatist takes us to different countries, as a venue of the act, the scene of the act. So in modern plays, Dryden says that these unities are often flouted. They are not conformed to. But if we will allow the ancients to have contrived well, we must acknowledge them to have written better. So if we are to establish that the ancient writers have contrived, that is, designed their plots well, then we must say that they have written also well. Questionless, we are deprived of a great stock of wit in the loss of Menander among the Greek poets, and of Caecilius, Afranius and Varius among the Romans. So most of the writings of these Greek and Roman authors have been lost. So Dryden says that we may assume that we have lost a great deal of good poetry, good drama, when we lost their plays. So we have to guess at Menander's excellence, because we cannot read him in the original. Terence often translates or imitates Menander. We may guess at Menander's excellency by the plays of Terence, who translated some of them, and yet wanted so much of him that he was called by Caesar the half Menander. Wanted so much of him means that he was never equal to him. He lacked a lot of qualities that Menander had. So Caesar commented that Terence was half Menander, and may judge of Varius by the testimonies of Horace Martial and Velleius Paterculus. So Varius, whose writings are lost, was imitated by, Dryden says, Horace Martial and Paterculus. But the editor says in a footnote that Horace and Martial, all right, but Velleius Paterculus did not imitate Varius. It is probable that these, could they be recovered, would decide the controversy. It is the controversy about whether one should follow the three unities or not. If these plays could be found, then they might have decided it. But so long as Aristophanes and Plautus are extant, at least the plays of Aristophanes and Plautus should not be lost. So as long as their plays are extant, we have some idea about Greek and Roman comedy. While the tragedies of Euripides, Sophocles and Seneca are in our hands, I can never see one of those plays which are now written, but it increases my admiration of the ancients. If we compare present writing of tragedies, currently written tragedies, to Sophocles, Euripides or Seneca. Sophocles and Euripides are Greek, Seneca was Roman. If we compare, then I would always find the ancients to be much superior than the modern writers. And yet I must acknowledge further that to admire them as we ought, we should understand them better than we do. So we must understand the ancient writers better. Understanding Greek authors or even Latin authors always involved learning their languages, learning Greek and Latin, which was always a struggle for English readers and writers. So Dryden says that if we want to pass any judgment on them, if we even want to say that they wrote excellently, they wrote very well, we must understand them better. Doubtless many things appear flat to us, the wit of which depended on some custom or story which never came to our knowledge, or perhaps on some criticism in their language, which being so long dead and only remaining in their books, it is not possible they should make us understand perfectly. So the authors might be referring to some contemporary custom about which we have no knowledge. Therefore we will not understand those comments. Or if we do not understand their language properly, then also we will not understand the plays. To read Macrobius explaining the propriety and elegancy of many words in Virgil, which I had before passed over without consideration as common things, is enough to assure me that I ought to think the same of Terence. So here is a note on Macrobius, the work that Dryden is referring to. The name of Macrobius's work is In Conviviorum Saturnaliorum Libri Septem. I am writing. So Dryden says that when I read Macrobius's book, which is a book of criticism, then I understand Virgil better, and also the same is true about Terence. So Macrobius's comments on these authors help me understanding these authors better, and that in the purity of his style, which truly so much valued that he ever carried his works about him, there is yet left in him great room for admiration, if I knew but where to place it. So the purity of Virgil's style can be appreciated if I knew which parts of the work should be appreciated. In other words, in order to read an ancient author and appreciate him thoroughly, one must read it in the original language and must develop the capability of appreciating the original language. In the meantime, I must desire you to take notice that the greatest man of the last age, Ben Jonson, was willing to give praise to them in all things. He was not only a professed imitator of Horace, but a learned plagiary of all the others. You track him everywhere in the snow. So Dryden praises Ben Jonson as a great master, but a great master in the neoclassical sense means that he is a great imitator of the ancients. So Virgil says, as a term of praise, that he plagiarizes very thoroughly, very well, poets such as Virgil, Martial, Terence, Seneca. So he uses the word plagiary. So plagiarism, which today we consider to be completely unacceptable and also a crime, that is, when you write something that you borrow from other writers without acknowledgement, then it is plagiarism. It is tantamount to stealing someone else's intellectual copyright. So in the Renaissance it was not the same, because the idea of individual intellectual copyright and the idea of individual genius, they were not developed at the time, and the more a writer could imitate past writers, the more he would be appreciated, because instead of concealing the source of his writing, A writer would expect the reader to be well read, to be learned enough to identify the sources which he is imitating. Therefore, the concealment of the name of the sources was not a crime. It was intended. It was a kind of mutual literary club where everybody was supposed to have already read all the classics. So, reading any new work could also mean testing the knowledge of other people in their in classical literature. If Horace, Lucan, Petronius, Arbiter, Seneca and Juvenal had their own from him, there are few serious thoughts which are new in him. So we see Dryden says that Juvenal, Horace, Seneca, their imitation can be found in Ben Jonson, and very little new to be found in him. It is mostly he imitates others. Very little originality you can find in him. So originality was not a term of praise at that time. Good imitation was a term of praise. Anybody who tried to be original, that was rather looked down upon. So today's values have completely changed. Dryden later remarked that Jonson borrowed boldly from the ancients. He invades authors like a monarch, and what would be theft in other poets is only victory in him. So he appreciates the boldness of Ben Jonson's imitation. You will pardon me therefore if I presume he loved their fashion when he wore their clothes. That is, when he imitated their style, he loved their writing. But since I have otherwise a great veneration for him, and you, Eugenius, prefer him above all other poets, I will use no further argument to you than his example. I will produce before you Father Ben, dressed in all the ornaments and colors of the ancients. You will need no other guide to our party if you follow him. So, Ben Jonson is being called here the Father Ben, that is the captain of the neoclassical team, the leader who demonstrates how one should imitate other great writers, ancient writers. Ornaments and colors, reference to rhetoric. So you imitate the way the ancient writers used rhetoric. And whether you consider the bad praise of our age or regard the good praise of the last, both the best and worst of the modern poets will equally instruct you to admire the ancients. So by looking at the contemporary writing critically, by looking at both bad plays as well as good plays, you will be able to understand what were the qualities that you admire in the ancients. Because insofar as the present plays imitate the ancients, they are good. Insofar as they fail in imitation, they are bad. So your knowledge of the ancients, the criteria of good writing will establish what is your knowledge of the ancients. So Critias here stops his discussion, which we know that was a promotion or upholding of the ancients as against that of the moderns. Then Eugenius was impatient to answer, and it begins. I have observed in your speech that the former part of it is convincing as to what the moderns have profited by the rules of the ancients, but in the latter you are careful to conceal how much they have excelled them. So Eugenius says that you do not say that the moderns excel the ancients in many matters. We own all the helps we have from them and want neither veneration nor gratitude, while we acknowledge that to overcome them we must make use of the advantages we have received from them. So Eugenius says that whatever we learn from the ancient, we must use that knowledge to surpass them. But to these assistances we have joined our own industry. So it is not that imitation means servile imitation. But the moderns also must contribute something. So that is where industry or hard work comes in. For had we sat down with a dull imitation of them, we might then have lost somewhat of the old perfection, but never acquired any that was new. So dull imitation is not desirable. The writer who is imitating the ancients must also know how to perfect his writing by adding something else. So we may say that in this speech we learn about the tradition of imitation. We draw not therefore after their lines but those of nature. Like when somebody copies the drawings of an ancient master. Eugenius says that we do not copy their lines but we copy nature. The principal purpose of art is to imitate nature. And having the life before us beside the experience of all they knew, it is no wonder if we hit some airs and features which they have missed. So if we try to copy nature on our own, because we are alive and they are dead, so we may find some features in nature which the ancients have missed. I deny not what your urge of arts and sciences that they have flourished, what you urge of arts and sciences that they have flourished in some ages more than others, but your instance in philosophy makes for me. For if natural causes be more known now than in the time of Aristotle, because more studied, it follows that poesy and other arts may with the same pains arrive still nearer to perfection, and that granted, it will rest for you to prove that they wrought more perfect images of human life than we. So Eugenius turns the argument of Crates against him. Crates' argument was that in philosophy, that is in science, there have been many developments in the modern times. But Eugenius says that if in science there are such developments over the ancients, then it is quite possible that in arts also there are more insights now than in the old times. So in poetry also, in drama, now there could be more perfection than among the ancients, which seeing in your discourse you have avoided to make good. You did not mention them. It shall now be my task to show you some part of their defects and some few excellencies of the moderns. So I will examine the ancients and show where they were defective and where the moderns are excellent or excel over them. And I think there is none among us can imagine I do it enviously or with purpose to detract from them. So you should not think that I am prejudiced against them. For what interest of fame or profit can the living lose by the reputation of the dead? So the dead are reputed, their reputation will not be reduced, even if I praise the moderns. On the other side, it is a great truth which Veius Paterculus affirms, audita visis leventus laudamus, and so on, that praise or censure is certainly the most sincere which unbribed posterity shall give us. So, the praise not of contemporaries but of posterity is more precious. Quoting from the Veius Paterculus. Be pleased then, in the first place, to take notice that the Greek poesy, which Crates has affirmed to have arrived to perfection in the reign of old comedy, was so far from it that the distinction of it into acts was not known to them, or if it were, it is yet darkly delivered to us that we cannot make it. So Eugenius says that in old comedy we do not see act division. They did not know it, or even if they knew It is not clearly set out. All we know of it is from the singing of their chorus, and that too is so uncertain that in some of their plays we have reason to conjecture they sung more than 5 times. So, if we assume that in every act there is a chorus, and the chorus sing together, but sometimes there could be songs more than 5 times, which means that it is not a proper indication of act division either. Aristotle indeed divides the integral parts of a play into 4. Now here Dryden gives a division of the parts of drama, and he says that these are from Aristotle, but actually these are from Scaliger's Poetics. You know, Scaliger was a humanist, a neoclassical critic. He was French, and Poetics written by Scaliger. Poetics. So what are the parts? 4 parts. First, the protasis or entrance, which gives light only to the characters of the persons and proceeds very little into any part of the action. So here the 4 parts are protasis, epitasis, catastasis and status. Now, in Aristotle, on the other hand, the 4 parts are prologue, episode, exodus and chorixon. I am writing here. In Aristotle, the 4 parts are prologue, episode, exodus and chorixon. So Scaliger says that the 4 parts are protasis, which is the entrance, and it gives only the information about the characters, and there is very little progression into action. Then epitasis, working up of the plot where the play grows warmer. So this is what we may say, we roughly say that exordium or beginning, then rising action, where the action becomes warmer. So epitasis, the design or action of it is drawing on, and you see something promising that will come to pass. Thirdly, the catastasis, called by the Romans status, the height and full growth of the play. When the plot fully develops, then it reaches status or catastasis. We may call it properly the counter turn, which destroys that expectation, embroils the action in new difficulties, and leaves you far distant from that hope in which it found you, as you may have observed in a violent stream resisted by a narrow passage. So in the earlier part, the second part, epitasis, the action grows warmer and something is expected, something is promised to happen. And in the catastasis or fully developed part, often that does not happen. Something opposite happens. So there is a turn which Dryden calls here counter turn. He is translating catastasis as counter turn. In Aristotelian terminology, we have reversal and discovery, anagnorisis. So here Dryden uses the term counter turn. So the plot becomes so intriguing that whatever was expected, that does not happen, something opposite happens. So think of, for example, Macbeth, which is not strictly Aristotelian, not strictly neoclassical, but we see that the expectations are raised that Macbeth would become a great king, but then something opposite happens. He becomes more and more of a criminal. It runs round to an eddy and carries back the water with more swiftness than it brought them on. Lastly, the catastrophe, which the Grecians called Lucis, the French le dénouement. Lucis or catastrophe, both are Greek terms. Dénouement is French term. So both Lucis and dénouement means untying of the knot where the problems are resolved, the plot is resolved. And we, I was forgetting the term, the reversal and recognition, peripeteia and anagnorisis. So Dryden means the same thing, but here he is not following Aristotle but following Scaliger. Therefore he is inventing the term, counter term, to mean to translate catastasis. So denouement, catastrophe, discovery or unraveling of the plot. There you see all things settling again upon their first foundations, and the obstacles which hindered the design or action of the play once removed. It ends with that resemblance of truth and nature, that the audience are satisfied with the conduct of it. So, the resolution of the plot, the catastrophe, reconciles the audience with what happens in the tragedy or in the play, because it is very similar, it is close to truth of nature. Thus this great man delivered to us the image of a play, and I must confess it is so lively that from thence much light has been derived to the forming it more perfectly into acts and scenes. Who is the great man? Aristotle. Without being a writer of plays, he is praised because he gave us the theory of the play, and ironically Dryden not even follows his theory here, follows Scaliger in the name of Aristotle and praises him. This kind of misadventures happen in writing, where you praise somebody else for somebody else's work. The lesson that we take from here is that the 17th and 18th century neoclassical writers, they were much more influenced by the Italian and French neoclassical critics than Aristotle or Greek critics, classical critics. So act and scene division is actually something modern, and the neoclassical critics tried their best to find a confirmation of act and scene division in Aristotle. We know that in the Renaissance, most of the Elizabethan and Jacobean plays, many of them did not have act and scene divisions, but these were later formulated by the editors of their plays. But what poet first limited to 5 the number of the acts, I know not. And even today we do not know. How did the 5-act division come into existence? Which poet or which critic first thought of dividing a play into 5 acts? We do not know. In many dramatic traditions, as Dryden mentions here, there are 3 acts. We of course later in modern times also have 1-act plays. So in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, 5-act division of a play was accepted as traditional, but we do not know who invented it. Only we see it so firmly established in the time of Horace that he gives it for a rule in comedy: Noe brevior quinto, noe sit productur actu. Neither more brief nor longer than 5 acts. That is the Horatian rule. 53. Let no play be either shorter or longer than 5 acts. So Horace was the god next to Aristotle in literary criticism in the 18th century. So that you see, the Grecians cannot be said to have consummated this art. So Eugenius' criticism of the ancients, of the Greeks, that they did not know the 5-act division. Probably it was, invented later. We find its first confirmation in Horace, which supports that it was more or less unknown to the Greeks. Writing rather by entrances than by acts, and having rather a general indigested notion of a play than knowing how and where to bestow the particular graces of it. So Eugenius says that the Greek playwriters, they began with entrances rather than acts, and their notion of a play was something that was not well digested. Therefore, we cannot follow them. But since the Spaniards at this day allow but 3 acts, which they call jornadas, to a play, and the Italians in many of theirs follow them, when I condemn the ancients, I declare it is not altogether because they have not 5 acts to every play, but because they have not confined themselves to one certain number. It is building an house without a model. And when they succeeded in such undertakings, they ought to have sacrificed to fortune, not to the muses. So Eugenius' criticism is that he says that I criticize the Greeks not because they did not always write plays with 5 acts, but because they did not stick to a particular pattern. So every time they, wrote different kind of play, the act division was not regular. So he says that it is like building a house without a plan. So you do not know beforehand how many rooms will be in the house. Similarly, you do not know how many acts will be there in the play. So it is very unplanned, and therefore only by accident such plays became successful. So when any of these plays became successful, that was more by accident rather than by design. Next, for the plot, which Aristotle called to muthos, and often tone, pragma, tone, synthesis, tone, pragma, tone, synthesis. So the editor says that plot is called muthos, not to muthos. Muthos meant plot or story. Okay, so here we see that the Spaniards are the plays that they wrote, they call them jornadas, as Dryden says. The playwrights, the Spanish playwrights referred to here particularly is Lope de Vega. Lope de Vega, 1562 to 1635, who was responsible for the adoption of the 3-act structure, but he did not use the term jornada. Jornada means day. The same root as journal, jour in French means day. As you know from the expression bonjour, good day. Jornada means play about a day. He used the word acto. Lope de Vega used the word acto. Jornada is common in Old Spanish from the 13th century, meaning duration of a day. But its first use in the sense of an act in a play dates from 1517. After Lope de Vega, the term jornada was brought back into fashion by Calderon and his followers. Another famous Renaissance Spanish playwright, Calderon, brought back the fashion of using the word jornada for the act, for an act of the play. So now Eugenius comes to talk about plot or mythos, and from him that is from Aristotle. The Romans called it fabula. It has already been judiciously observed by a late writer that in their tragedies it was only some tale derived from Thebes or Troy, or at least something that happened in those two ages. So fabula is the Latin of plot. The stories were either from Thebes or Troy, which was worn so threadbare by the pens of all the epic poets and even by tradition itself of the talkative Greeklings, as Ben Jonson calls them, that before it came upon the stage, it was already known to all the audience. So, the stories of mythology, of Thebes or Troy, they were known to all the Greeks. The Greeks are being satirized here as talkative Greeklings. Juvenal in his satire, Cicero de Oratore, and Johnson in Discoveries uses the term Greeklings. So Greeks have been satirized right from the Roman poet Juvenal, then by Cicero, and then Ben Jonson. So Dryden is only following them. So everybody in the audience knew the story of the play. And the people, so soon as ever they heard the name of Oedipus, knew as well as the poet that he had killed his father by mistake and committed incest with his mother before the play. So everybody knew the story of Oedipus. That they were now to hear of a great plague, an oracle, and the ghost of Laius. So all these things will be brought in any play on Oedipus, so that they sat with a yawning kind of expectation. So they would be very bored because they knew the story, till he was to come with his eyes pulled out and speak 100 or more verses in a tragic tone. So Dryden presents the whole thing in a very humorous manner. So blind Oedipus would come and say a few lines in a tragic tone in complaint of his misfortunes. But one Oedipus, Hercules or Medea had been tolerable. Poor people, they escaped not so good cheap. They had still the chapeau bouillie set before them, till their appetites were cloyed with the same dish, and the novelty being gone, the pleasure vanished. So, the poor audience, they were given the same fare day after day. The same story of Oedipus or other stories from these cycles with which they were so familiar. So Dryden says that the stories of Oedipus, Hercules, Medea, if they were witnessed only once, then they would have enjoyed it. But these stories were repeated in play after play. They had still the chapeau bouillie, that is the boiled food, which was the same menu day after day. So that one main end of dramatic poesy in its definition, which was to cause delight, was of consequence destroyed. So earlier you remember Critias gives the definition of dramatic poesy or drama, and the end of drama, he said, was to entertain and instruct. So Eugenius says that one of these ends, that is to delight, that is lost. The audience does not find any delight in the play because the same story is repeated. Okay, so I think it is past time. If you have any question, you can ask me.